Welcome and thank you for joining us for another session of our 2021 Climate Action webinar series. My name is Frank Ostrom. I'm chair of AIA Coats Education Subcommittee, and I'll probably be the moderator. Well, I will be the moderator for today's segment. Next slide. As you know, AIA California has developed an in-depth series focused on understanding and implementing the AIA Framework for Design Excellence. This series will run through the end of the year and feature monthly hour-long general climate action webinars, as well as 90-minute webinars that dive deeper into technical topics. Today is a technical topic. It's a 90-minute session. Additionally, AIA California has partnered with various organizations with like-minded goals to bring bonus content to you in the comfort of your office, wherever you may find your office these days. As always, the webinar content we'll have additional resources that are available on the AIA California website, and they'll be posted shortly after the session. A few quick housekeeping reminders before we get started. Today's session qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units. For those watching live, AIA California staff will report these units for you. The session is also being recorded and will be posted on AIA California website, and additional resources are on that website after the presentation as well. Next slide. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to ask any question for today's presenter. Don't use the chat, please use the Q&A function. And if you like the question, hit the thumbs up and it'll move up on the queue. Next slide. Today's presentation we'll be looking at the value of energy modeling for non-residential projects. Andrea is an associate AIA in HOK in the Washington, D.C. office, and she spent a lot of time working on calculating the payback time of energy modeling for several of the firm's projects, which she's going to demonstrate. Okay, next slide. That's what Andrea looks like. And if you want to get hold of her resume, that's online too, because I think we want to spend more time in the presentation itself. But as I said, she's based in DC and she's got a whole litany of things that she's involved in. So with that, Andrea, it's all yours, baby.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. Okay. All right, so today we're going to talk about design for energy, and in particular, we're going to be talking about the business case for energy modeling and all of the reasons why we like to do energy modeling on our projects. And there's a long list, so I'll try to go through, I think, some of the highlights. So why do we use energy modeling and simulation in the design process? Why do we think this is so critical? One of the first things that always comes up in this conversation, particularly amongst my peers, my colleagues, both at HOK and other firms I speak to, is, we're just doing this for code compliance. We can use ComCheck. We don't need a model. The client didn't ask for a model. And so the question is, are we just doing modeling for code compliance? And I would posit that code compliance is an awfully long way down the road to find out how your building is anticipated to perform. As architects, we are often looking for data, for information, for feedback. We're doing project-specific calculations on a variety of issues in anticipation of how the building could and should perform, particularly under our particular design considerations. Can you imagine if we waited until we were submitting our design for a permit or even C of O at the moment of inspection to get data about soils and do our geotesting? Of course, we want that information as early as possible in the design process. It has such a huge impact on so many critical components of building design. Would we wait until code compliance and submitting for just a permit to get information, critical information about structural loads and how different building components have to come together and are fastened to one another? Obviously, we try to do our best to make sure all these calculations are performed as required, but also throughout construction built as designed. But the point being that there are goals established calculations are performed, and there is a whole series of steps to validate against those targets and those requirements throughout the design and construction process. Failure is not pretty. It is rare, though, when we do those things. Same thing with wind loads. Can you imagine if we waited till we were submitting for a permit to do wind load calculations and decide how we were going to enclose our building to withstand lateral loads? Or seismic loads. I know this is of critical importance in California. Can you imagine waiting until the end of the design process to get feedback on seismic considerations? And the point in this is that there are so many points of data that we have to consider from the earliest stages of design throughout, as well as validate in the construction process. Energy is no less critical, particularly given the billions of dollars of damage from climate change that occur to the built environment every single year, tens of billions. That this is no less critical that we start to pay attention to how buildings are going to perform or anticipated to perform, and we validate that throughout the design process and the construction process. So in the energy simulation process, while we're looking for information about how the building will perform from an energy standpoint, my position is there are other meaningful data points in that early simulation and building performance analysis that are helpful to understand. This is a project where there were some critical moisture issues, moisture and infiltration issues that created some building failures. And doing early simulation using tools like WFI to understand where those failures could occur, and also doing validation, peer review, enclosure commissioning, assembly testing. Those are all things that we're doing now from an energy requirement or standpoint, but could also prevent other types of challenges that are not desirable in a finished building. Also, we know that there have been some legal risks associated with unanticipated solar heat gain, discomfort, inefficiency to HVAC because of those issues. And so, we need to kind of keep our eye on down the road, is someone going to hold us as designers accountable for how this building not only performs from an energy perspective, but how comfortable it is. And if they have to make updates to the building, retrofit the building because of design decisions we made, is that a desirable outcome? We might be code compliant, but we're still creating impacts that we may be held accountable for down the road when the building has been delivered. Thermal bridging. This is another area where we want to understand how heat is transferred in a building from interior to exterior or exterior to interior. We might be doing that analysis for energy purposes, but it also has a huge impact on things like condensation and ultimately indoor air quality. And again, that's one of those things where we can avoid so much risk down the road if we're doing these types of simulations, maybe driven by energy and climate, but ultimately covering a lot of other bases as well. And then things like understanding how the sun and our building respond to one another, insulation, reflection. Is it possible for a concentration of solar radiation to occur? Is it possible for this building to reflect on adjacent areas? In this case, this was a building built next to the Nasher Sculpture Garden in Dallas. Initially proposed to be a shorter tower and then ultimately built much taller, and quite a bit of impact from that on the sculpture garden and the pieces within it. And I think everyone's familiar with the infamous walkie-talkie building. And this is another project where had studies been done from an energy perspective, looking at insulation, how solar radiation was going to hit that building, also may have discovered some of the other unintended impacts, which was concentration of that radiation on objects on the road adjacent to the building. Ultimately, I think as designers, none of us want to see this happen to one of our buildings where you have to go back and add shades, grills, louvers, draping, veils, all kinds of things to what we thought was really, beautiful design, to repair something that is not functioning to such a degree that it has caused major disruption in the community that we built it for. And so this is not an ideal outcome. And while we're looking at energy impacts, we can also be looking at some of these and help with risk mitigation. And then the other thing I will also mention is that we're making people really, really uncomfortable when we don't do these types of studies. So outside of energy performance, carbon emissions, climate change, we make people terribly uncomfortable. And you'll be able to tell that I'm the life of the party wherever I go amongst designers, because I like to drive around or walk around, or whenever I visit a city, however I'm getting around, take photos of buildings with all the shades down. And that's because too often we're creating both thermal and visual discomfort by not designing for the solar conditions that that building exists within. The building on the upper left is one, it was cold outside. People were wearing sweaters, jackets, coats, and we walked inside and I watched people literally put on sunglasses and start taking their clothes off. They were all in business attire and suddenly the suit jackets come off, the overcoats came off. People are down to their bare arms in a business tour, business conference. They're down to bare arms. And it's because this building was incredibly hot in this space. We were creating a great face due south, great deal of glare and heat gain. Now, there may have been some interplay between the designer and the client. And the client's like, I want unmitigated solar and view access on this floor. And on upper levels, they did have both some exterior shades and some interior shades, but then those shades are down all the time, right? And so that starts to obscure view, and we have to ask ourselves, what's the point of putting that much glass on a building for that unrestricted view when the view is in fact going to be restricted by shades all the time? These other images show multifamily, office buildings, and even higher ed education, academic buildings. And in one case, a lab building. And so, while we want participants, occupants in a building to participate in building performance, I would also position it's unreasonable to expect someone in a research environment to take off their PPE, walk over to the window, move the shade, adjust it based on sun angle, and then go back to the bench and put their PPE back on. This isn't a reasonable expectation. And so when we don't provide architectural glare control, we're basically giving people a condition where they're either always uncomfortable from glare or heat gain, thermally and visually uncomfortable, or they very rarely get that view or daylight, because there isn't a good permanent solution to glare control. In many cases, we do try to advocate for automated shades, but those often, as we know, fall victim to value engineering and one of the first things to go in the chopping block. And so this is one of those areas where I'd say energy simulation cannot be the only lever. We also have to be thinking about occupant comfort, well-being, productivity. But while we're looking at these things, we are also evaluating for energy performance. So I also often hear from many people in our profession that we're not doing an energy model because we're not going to pursue LEED certification. Therefore, we don't need one because we don't need it. Again, we might be doing ComCheck or some other validation for code compliance. LEED's great. It's a great third-party tool to validate that a project has achieved certain milestones. But if you're only doing energy modeling for LEED points, I want you to take that, wad it up, and throw it in the trash heap. I think that's one of the worst reasons to do energy modeling that exists. LEED is meant to validate after you've designed a high-performance building. LEED points are not a driver, and I would argue that they don't have much currency with our clients. Because let's say the client has set a target of LEED Gold certification, and you're in the VE process, and the client says, if I do this, how many points do I lose? And maybe it's not enough to lose a whole point, or maybe you do lose a point, but you're still tracking LEED Gold. Then the client says, go ahead and get rid of it. I don't need it because the only thing that mattered was LEED points. That's what we were talking about, was LEED points. We gave energy savings an assigned value of LEED points instead of talking about what it really meant, which was, this is going to save you $100,000 a year in energy costs, or this is going to help us right-size your HVAC system and save you this much in construction costs. So when we do energy simulation from the earliest stages of design throughout design refinement, and even sometimes, yes, in construction, we should be associating it with a value that has more meaning to a client and is a little bit harder to toss aside in the value engineering process. I'll show you a couple examples as we get through this, but I just want to point out that this is not a great argument for doing energy modeling, nor is it a great argument against doing it when you're not pursuing a LEED project. So what are the good arguments for doing energy modeling? One is that modeling pretty much pays for itself almost instantaneously. Several years ago, we did a study at HOK across multiple building types, and we've updated it periodically. We'll toss updated data into a quick analysis. But we looked at offices, justice centers, convention center, hospitals, healthcare buildings. We looked at a lot of different project types, as you can see here, research buildings, and said, what are we spending on modeling? How much energy does this building save based on the design that we were able to achieve through simulation in the design process? And if we look at the energy savings on a cost basis, how many months did it take to pay for that energy modeling service? And we found that across, this is a sample of building types, across the board, it was almost a month or two, sometimes 3 or 4. We had one project pursuing net zero where it was a small building. We did a lot of modeling to get to net zero. So it was a 7-month payback, but pretty much across the board, it was under a year. And in many cases, literally just a month or two of energy savings. And then we paid for the energy modeling service. So I would ask any of our clients, how many things could you do with a 1-month payback that you would then reap the benefits of for the next, 40, 50, 60, 70 plus years of ownership? How many things would you turn down with that kind of ROI? I don't know of many. It's about as quick as it gets. So we published a blog on the DOE website, The Shockingly Short Payback of Energy Modeling, and one of our engineering partners reviewed it. I actually heard from a lot of engineers who were like, this is great. We never looked at it this way. But we're really excited that you published that. We plugged some of our buildings into it, and we wanted to see what it looked like. So you're one architect working with lots of engineers, and that's what you found. We're one engineer working with lots of different architects, and they found that almost universally, yes, the cost was under a year. The curve started to slow down when they got under 25,000 square feet, where the payback started to get a little bit longer. And so for them, they felt like maybe that was the cutoff where it wasn't as reasonable of a payback. However, I always say rules are meant to be broken. This is a couple projects here where we were a sustainability consultant. We were not the architect on the next two. But I just wanted to point out that the energy modeling payback was under a year despite the small size of these projects. And the first was just under 17,000 square feet for an office building, and then a 4,000 square foot retail building. And energy modeling paid for itself in just a few months, in part because of some of the great tax incentives that were achieved for going for LEED Platinum. And so there was a desire to really target energy performance in these buildings. But they're also a long-term owner developer who was going to hold these assets for their entire life, and so was really interested in cost of ownership and not just development costs. So the tax incentive does not factor into the payback, only as a driver for high performance design. And then this one is one of those as well. It is over 25,000 square feet, but it's another one where we were not the designer, but we were the sustainability consultant. And it's a little bit bigger, but you can see again, energy modeling payback on a hotel here, 2.2 months. And so, the driver was really long-term ownership costs first. I think the tax incentives followed very swiftly thereafter. Maybe it made the difference between pursuing LEED Gold or Platinum, was to really get that full 5 years of 75% property tax abatement. But the energy modeling costs were negligible and paid for themselves really quickly through energy savings. In the case of this hotel, it is on the Capitol Beltway in Silver Spring, Maryland. And so some of the things that we did for noise attenuation, being so close to the Beltway, were also energy savers and vice versa. So having a really well-sealed envelope, a really good glazing, the things that made this building perform well from an energy perspective, made it dead quiet inside those rooms. And the things that we were doing to make it very, very quiet inside those rooms made it a good energy performer. And they went hand in hand. So sort of getting double bang for your buck in that investment in the enclosure. And just a couple others. This is a core and shell building where the owner occupied a very small percentage of it, a couple floors out of the entire building, but still energy modeling payback, a couple months, just 100,000 square feet, not a massive building, and another one of a similar size. In this case, it was a building that was retrofitted, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in just a moment. I have a quick question here I want to answer. Someone's asking about payback. So we're looking at the cost of the energy modeling service and then the monthly reduction in energy costs based on what a code compliant building would be and the design building is. And in most of these cases, we have actual performance data. So this isn't just how we model the building to perform, it's how the building actually performs. So had we just done a code compliant building, here's what we would have spent every month on energy. And then because we were able to use energy simulation in the design process to get a higher performance building, here's how much we save every month, and here's how long it took to pay back for the energy modeling service. We're going to get into other payback forms, but right now that is the direct payback we're talking about, is the monthly cost savings for energy costs, utility costs, compared to the cost of the energy modeling service. So hopefully that is helpful. And so this is one where we had an existing building, it's 2 buildings actually, where we did a deep green retrofit. And again, payback was about 4 months, maybe a little bit under. It is difficult sometimes to get this number because some consultants just sort of fold modeling into their design services. Others do break it out as a line item fee. And so it's a little easier when it's broken out. When it's not, they're just like, that's just part of design. I think that's great. It should be the way it is. But also makes it harder to calculate payback directly when you have to sort of estimate what the cost of modeling was. The DDX, I'm sure everyone on this call has signed on to the 2030 commitment and is not only recording your energy targets, but your modeled energy savings on all of your design projects every year. They often ask us, what is the cost of energy modeling? Because the DOE wants that information, and they've partnered with the AIA to help collect it. And we don't always know. And sometimes that's because the consultants just enfold it up in their design fee, and that's okay. Same thing as the architects, we do the same. Sometimes the cost of a high performance design, including daylight modeling or other types of simulation, might be all wrapped up into one fee. So it's hard to always say exactly that's the cost of energy modeling. That's all good stuff. Some interesting questions. I will get back to phase change materials. That's all interesting stuff. Okay, so I can pay for my energy modeling service very quickly with monthly energy savings. That's one reason to do it. Another reason to do it is that setting a target, as we just discussed with the 2030 commitment, and modeling against that target consistently throughout the design process can be very powerful. I'll give you an example. So this project here is the University of Maryland, Baltimore Health Science Facility 3. It is 421,000 square foot building. We finished a few years ago now. And so it is a lab. It is wet lab intensive. There's a vivarium in there. It is a very energy intensive building. So when we looked at the baseline EUI, it was over 400 kb2 per square foot per year. And when we were doing our goal setting charrette with the client, we said, what are your sustainability goals for this project? And they said, we want a LEED Gold certification. So that's great. We'll get you your LEED Gold. Don't worry about that. But what do you want out of LEED Gold? What do you want? Do you want daylighting? Do you want views? Do you want water performance? Do you want energy performance? What are the goals? And we had someone from the O&M team who is managing all of their campus buildings, who manages their access to the campus energy plant and the capacity that they have, and who does their annual carbon disclosures, for example. And so this guy at the back of the room says, I want 180 kb2 per square foot per year, because he knows on a lab of this building, building of this type of lab, that was a really good reduction from other lab buildings that they had on campus. And so that was the target he articulated. And I can tell you that was early stages of design. From start to finish, there was a lot of turnover in the client organization. The people that were around that table were not all there by the time we finished. There's turnover in our consultant organizations, even on our side. So by the end of the project, I'm not sure anyone remembered that that was not in our contract. That was not a requirement that we had to meet. But somebody just set a number. And by the time we were done, this was at 166 kb2 per square foot per year, because of course, and engineers being very risk averse, we're like, we're going to go underneath what we're required to do and make sure that this is a high performance, and architects as well. We all wanted to have a good solid enclosure, good energy management strategies, good mechanical design to accommodate the loads of this building. And so just it didn't add any cost to this building. You know, this was a publicly funded building. It's a public institution. So there was a bond that funded this project, and there was no going back to the well for more money. So it wasn't give me more money so I can improve the design so that it will do better, perform better, and it will pay back over 5 years or 10 years or 20 years in energy efficiency savings. We had to do it for the same exact budget that we started with, but because we set that target, we were able to achieve a much higher performance than we otherwise would have by setting a goal and benchmarking against it regularly. I mentioned the 2030 commitment. As everyone knows, we're all hopefully striving towards carbon neutral design portfolios by 2030. There's been a little bit of movement, but primarily we're all kind of, as an industry, hovering roughly around the energy code. Obviously in California, you have Title 24 and other drivers that put you far out in advance of this. But many firms in California are probably similar to HOK, designing in a lot of locations that are operating under a lot of different energy codes. So some are very advanced and others are less so. In fact, there are states that don't even have a statewide energy code. It's left to the jurisdiction, like the city or the county. So we're working in a variety of situations when it comes to energy requirements. We're also working in a lot of different countries. And so our own goals are really an important part of this process. And so we're very transparent. You know, we set our goals and we continue to try to do 5% better every year, and we don't always hit that target, but we think an important part of continuous improvement is both the goal setting and the benchmarking, and that transparency, that we're willing to acknowledge where we are and where we need to be. And so this is our own reduction against 2030 baseline on average across our entire global portfolio, including international projects, including renovations, not just new construction, and including complex projects like airports or hospitals or labs or stadiums, everything. So we've got some net positives in there, net zeros in there, and then we've got some things that are real struggle, maybe because it's a retrofit of an existing building and you can't fix everything. And so those are some of the challenges. Also some large international projects that have different energy, codes and constraints. So that's how we're doing. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting about 2030, if you're a regular reporter, you used to be able to say, it will be modeled. I have a contract to do energy modeling and I have set a target, and you could report that project as its target and as a modeled project because you had set a target and would model it. Now, and just as of this last year, 2020, you can no longer do that. You can't track projects as modeled if you just say it will be modeled. It has to have already had a model conducted on it, no matter how early in design it might be. And so our modeling percentage by gross square foot dropped off from like 92% to 73%, because some projects in very early design, you know, programming and planning cannot count as modeled. But to us, that just means we need to start sooner, and we hadn't been starting maybe early enough in all cases. The AIA has been roughly in that 50–55% by gross square foot range of projects energy modeled by gross square footage. And so, you know, we aren't going to pat ourselves on the back too hard. I think it's great that we're doing better than the industry average, but all boats have to rise in this situation if we want to get our way, make our way out of climate change. So we hope that this type of presentation convinces all of our peer organizations, if you're not already modeling everything all the time, please do, really critical, and the earlier the better. So one of the things we have found through our work with 2030 is that when we set a target early and model consistently to benchmark against that target, our simple program projects like office buildings, academic buildings, things that are more external load driven, driven by, you know, heating, cooling, et cetera, orientation, massing, we consistently can get a 60–70% reduction from the 2030 baseline without adding cost, just by setting that target early. And then on the complex projects like labs and hospitals and things like that, that are maybe an internal load driven project, and that would be ventilation, plug loads, equipment, things like that, we can still get to 50 or 60% reduction from 2030 baseline without adding cost. And that's just because we're setting early targets and benchmarking regularly in the design process. So if you can get that far without adding any cost to the project, the question is why we're not doing it every single time as an industry. Why we wouldn't, what client asks for a low performance building if they can have a high performance building that does not cost more to build. So another reason that we think it's really important to do energy modeling is future proofing. We're entering an era where there are increasingly transparency policies or benchmarking policies that publicly disclose our building's performance every single year. And now there is a new era of building performance standards. We have them in place in Washington State, New York City, Washington, D.C., St. Louis. Montgomery County, right outside of DC, has signaled that they're going to follow. We've heard from other jurisdictions like Boston and Cambridge. We know we have tune-up requirements in cities like Philadelphia, and so on. And so we think, particularly because the Biden administration and the American Jobs Plan also have mentioned trying to incentivize national building performance standards, or at least incentivize cities and states and counties to pass their own. We're going to see more and more of this. And that means that your building, once you deliver it, once you've walked away, it was code compliant, check, will be held accountable for its performance forever. And so we think the best way of managing that risk, of handling that risk and future-proofing it, is to talk about anticipated performance early and often in the design process. I showed you this project before. It was two 1970s brutalist buildings in Washington, D.C. Our current energy performance standard in D.C. for office buildings is based on an Energy Star score, the local median Energy Star score for offices, which is 71. So as you can see, and that's just the first cycle for the first 5 years, as you can see, one of these buildings failed that standard. The other one came in just above it, but likely wouldn't have passed in cycle 2 or 3 or 4. So by looking at this and looking at the energy performance standard and saying, I know I want to be out ahead of that for the next 30 years so that I'm not required to do another renovation just for this building performance standard, I know I need to target something well ahead of the local building performance standard. And so in this case, we have those two existing buildings. Our client wanted a single unified Class A office building. We had to go through HPRB review, even though it is in and of itself not a historic building. It is down the street from the White House and it is in a historic corridor. So we had to match context. And we ended up rescanning a couple of the facades, replacing windows and insulation on the other two. We did unify the core and the lobbies. We did replace mechanical. We ended up going with VRF. There are some concerns with refrigerants, of course, and climate change, but in this case, because of a zoning change, if you use less of your penthouse level for mechanical equipment, you get more of it that you're now able to use for occupiable space, which is rental income, as anyone in real estate knows. And this also did improve energy performance. And so that was a driver. Also, the mechanical closet on each floor was very small. And so that gave back more leasable office space per floor by having smaller mechanical closets, and not having big cooling towers on the roof gave back more space on the penthouse level. So there are co-benefits to this kind of renovation as well. We have stormwater regulations and a green area ratio. And so while we're doing this, we're also doing 8-inch plus 8 to 30 inches of green roof and site landscaping. And so you're creating habitat, heat island mitigation, just urban green space, biophilic design, all of that other great stuff. But the important thing while we're doing this is that we were able to validate the energy design approach for these existing buildings, and that this rehab was half the cost and half the time of new construction for a Class A building. And its projected Energy Star score is in the 90s. Their first year of occupancy was COVID. I think they had had an anchor tenant for just a few months and then COVID hit. So I don't know how it's going to, how its exact Energy Star score, because the occupancy has been really irregular. But we're hoping moving forward, as people go back into the workplace, that we'll get to see some great performance numbers out of this in occupancy. So that's very exciting. So another thing here, modeling can calculate operational payback and first cost premium. So we've talked about scenarios where maybe we're not adding a first cost premium. And so what if we did ask our clients to undertake an upgrade to baseline design, maybe spend a little bit more money on something that would improve performance, and modeling can help calculate how quickly does that pay for itself, right? And so there is a perception gap. I think we know people from studies think that high performance and green buildings cost more than they do. So while they might cost less than code compliant buildings or up to 12.5% more, the perception is that they can cost up to 30% more. And so, there is a perception. I don't want to spend more on a green building. Green buildings or high performance buildings are going to cost a whole lot more. They don't have to, but there can be a cost premium if we're talking about certain types of systems, whether that's an enclosure system or a mechanical system, or otherwise. And so we do know that, there have been lots of studies that stratify the sort of hard costs of high performance buildings. And then, of course, there's soft costs. Maybe that is the energy simulation itself. That might be commissioning, enclosure and mechanical commissioning, or electrical commissioning. There might be specialty consultants, facade consultants, assembly testing, third-party certifications, et cetera. So all that wrapped up, there could be a premium. Doesn't have to be necessarily, but sometimes there is. And so when there is, we use modeling to calculate that. But as I always say, the big weakness of this is future payback is in the future. And a lot of our clients don't have the luxury of waiting for the future. Certainly in the last 10 plus years since the 2009 recession, I found if there was ever a time when clients were willing to spend more on green buildings, I think that has eroded. And it's for a variety of reasons. They're smart. They do understand the equation. If I spend more on a better building now, it will pay for itself later. But some of them are institutional projects that had to pass enabling legislation. There's a fixed bond. You cannot go back and get more money. I mentioned that with the University of Maryland, Baltimore project. We're working on a hospital in Washington, D.C. right now. Same thing. One time, this is your money, we're done. So you've got to fit it in that budget. There are also many clients, as I'm sure all of you have experienced, where the capital budget and the O&M budget are never going to meet. They're in two completely different buckets, and saving money in your capital expenses, doesn't go into your operational budget, and saving money in your operational budget doesn't feed back to pay you for something that you spent more on in your capital budget. So you've got to figure out, again, how do we do this in a cost neutral way? And for private developers in particular, I found that some of the scenarios we encounter frequently are a project that might be resold very quickly. And that might even be while it's under construction or very quickly after construction completes. And so you can't wait for a year or two or three for payback. So perhaps if you can sell it for a premium, that's great, but otherwise you're not waiting for O&M savings, right? You have to be able to do it within a certain budget in order to meet your pro forma. And then other issues or constraints may be that just a developer might need to free up their capital for the next project they want to get started. And so they can't sink it all into one project without reducing the opportunity of the next. So the holy grail that we always say is first cost savings or construction cost savings. We're looking for opportunities to come into that negative 0.4% I showed you when green projects or high performance projects, really energy efficient projects cost less. So less than their counterparts. That's why we want to leverage simulation, is to look for those opportunities. So a study by Davis Langdon did show that there's no significant difference in the average cost for green or high performance buildings compared to their counterparts. Sometimes it does cost more, sometimes it costs less, sometimes it costs the same per square foot. It really depends a lot on the quality of construction and design that was intended from the beginning, but it also is heavily dependent on the process. And so hiring folks who are experienced with looking for these types of trade-offs, using an integrated design process, and really trying to incorporate high performance strategies as early as possible rather than adding them on is important. And I always say true sustainable design should be reductive, not additive, right? We're looking for opportunities to carve away rather than just keep putting more and more on the project. So in concept, we're talking about trade-offs. So maybe I'll give you a little bit more for the enclosure budget, but it helps reduce my mechanical budget. And sometimes it's the opposite. And I'm going to talk about a couple specific examples in a little more detail, but a very simple example here is BJC in St. Louis, Barnes Jewish Community Hospital. This is one where we were looking at triple pane glazing for patient rooms. Certainly can improve acoustics and thermal comfort, but it also ended up eliminating the need for perimeter heat. And so our long-term energy savings is great. It would have paid for itself out of those savings over time. However, by eliminating the perimeter heat system, it paid for itself immediately. So it was a cost-neutral decision that has long-term energy performance implications, and that's the kind of strategy that we're looking for. And that's a very quick example. Now I'm going to show you a couple more detailed studies and projects where we were able to trade off between mechanical and enclosure, reduced loads, right-size systems, and also thermal programming. So this is what we call complex program project. It is a DC Consolidated Forensic Lab. It is the morgue, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, the Public Health Lab, and the Forensic Lab for the Metropolitan Police Department. This was completed several years ago, and this is a way old version of LEED 2.2, but this is something that at the time came in 60% below the 2030 baseline. The predicted EUI was 225, which for this building at 100% outside air was still doing pretty well, but actually performs below that. And most importantly, we were only required to do LEED Silver. We were able to hit LEED Platinum because of all of the performance improvements that were made, and we still came in 17% under budget. And that is what we're looking for. That's the secret sauce. No clients are going to turn down a high performance building that does not cost them more and that actually saves them money. And so that's what we're trying to do. So thermal programming, if you're, you may be familiar with it, but if you're not, is that idea that when we are organizing the building, we are giving thought to where spaces are in relationship potentially to organization and orientation, to adjacencies that might enable certain strategies like equipment sharing or cascading air. In this case, we decided to put the offices on the south where we could control the glare and heat gain. We moved the desks off the window wall so we could have kind of a buffer zone. And then we moved the labs to the north side where we didn't have to worry about any kind of, we need to add heat or add cooling because of heat gain. This is indirect light. We don't have to worry about glare. We don't have to worry about people in the lab moving window shades. We have a much more benign environment over here. And then from a blocking and stacking perspective, we put the morgue on the top floor, which is unusual. And then, we had the public health lab, and then we had DNA and other, forensics as you move down, like ballistics testing and fingerprinting and so on. And there are some public and education spaces on the ground level floor. One of the really interesting things here when we talk about thermal programming and blocking and stacking and organizing a building this type is internal load driven building. This is 100% outside air. And so fan energy, plug load energy are really driving the needle. And so in this case, the space with the highest air change rate requirements was the morgue. And so we decided to put it on the top floor closest to the penthouse to reduce the duct run and the fan energy required to ventilate it. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. This didn't cost more to put it there versus somewhere else, but there's a huge implication when it comes to ongoing energy performance for the building. And so in the old days, you didn't necessarily want to put the morgue at the top. You put it down in the basement because of formaldehyde and fumes, but we don't use those things anymore, primarily or in the OCME. So this is something that we were able to do, and it gave also the people who work there daylight and views, which they don't normally get. It was a great recruiting and retention tool for them. We also looked at facades by orientation. If we're really doing climate responsive design, each facade should not look the same. And so in the north, we were able to do some strip windows. The sill height is at bench height. We don't need to lower it because we know it's all labs on that side of the building, so we can be really consistent. And then on the east and west, we have where we have lower sun angles, harder to control, very narrow deep set windows, punched openings that help self-control the light and the glare. We are nerdy, so that is a DNA sequence that is stamped into the side of the building for the east and west facades. Have a little fun with it. And then on the south facade, we did, where the offices are, a dynamic louver wall. And so we got some great views to some green space that was right across the street. And we did a glass louver wall that was offset by about 1 meter, and there's a 50% ceramic frit pattern on those glass louvers to help block heat gain and glare. So, and then as I mentioned, the office space itself, the desks are offset from the window wall, so you have a little bit of a buffer zone. You don't have to carefully control the temperature range right next to the window wall, but this does all of the work in terms of, or most of the work in terms of blocking glare and heat gain. Those louvers are controlled by a weather station on the roof. You can't see all of my arms because my camera is not quite big enough, but normally they are adjusted based on sun angle and time of day. If it gets really windy, they will go completely lateral, so there's no lateral resistance. And then if it is the barometric pressure drops suddenly, we think it's going to ice or snow, they'll go completely vertical so that no accumulation of ice or snow builds up on those louvers. So that is how those work and how they look. And you really don't see the frit pattern from very far away or even fairly close up. It's also bird safe design, so it helps deter bird collision because they can see the pattern. It doesn't reflect light, so that's really helpful, but you do see the view through them quite clearly. And then we did do analysis to look at whether or not this would in fact be effective at keeping that radiation out of the building interior so that we weren't cooling unnecessarily or increasing our energy use because of heat gain. And then here we have chill beams. We ended up going with, because of the 100% outside air, went with a chill beam system. This did reduce floor to floor height, which is one of the trade-offs that help with cost mitigation. So we didn't have to pay for as much enclosure material. You can actually see those right here. These are active chill beams. You can see that perimeter circulation zone as well. We do have daylight harvesting controls, but for photography, everyone likes to override those and let everything light up so you can see everything on. But we did that. And then of course we had 100% energy recovery ventilation. We used enthalpy wheels for general exhaust and glycol runaround loops for the lab exhaust. And then we had a energy recovery chiller, heat shift chiller, which basically harvested waste heat from lab equipment or other equipment and then replug that into outside air or other things as needed. Just move the heat around the building rather than exhausting it and generating new heat when heat was needed. Use it for reheat, after latent cooling processes took place. So all those things said and done, we were able to afford some really nice spaces like this little edge atrium and this cantilevered stair, nice finishes as well. And this helps connect all the public, I shouldn't say public spaces, all of the common use spaces like conference rooms and break rooms for the staff so that they're encouraged to move from floor to floor. And so in this case, because it's performing better than anticipated, the energy modeling payback would have been 1.3 months, but it was actually 1 month of operational savings. But when we look at construction costs and the 17% under budget final construction cost, it actually paid for itself right away. We were able to reduce peak loads enough to get rid of a chiller. We were able to reduce floor to floor height by looking at systems early, looking at the interplay between enclosure and systems, thermal programming, all of those things. We were able to come in with a very high performance building under budget. And that is the ideal. There are a couple questions before I move on. One, I said I would get back to why is phase change, why are phase change materials not used in energy modeling? I agree. I think that there's a lot of potential with phase change materials. And for anyone not familiar with phase change materials, think of the ice pack you put in your cooler. It's frozen when you take it out of the freezer. As it absorbs heat, it liquefies, and that is changing phases. And then when you put it back in the freezer, it reassumes its solid state and it changes phases again. And so there are materials that can be embedded in ceiling tiles and drywall. There are some studies done on phase change materials in the walls. So they're basically thermal mass, but without as much mass. They can be tuned to different temperatures at which they change phases. So at what temperature does it melt or solidify? And the idea is that when everyone shows up in the building, let's say in the morning in the workplace, you start turning on lights and computers and the people bring in their own body heat. And so all this stuff generates heat and they can absorb that heat throughout the day and slowly liquefy in their encapsulated spaces. And then you don't have to cool just to offset that heat, that internal heat. And then when everyone leaves at night, it can dissipate that heat. You could flush the building if you want, and they re-solidify, they refreeze. I think they're great technology. I haven't seen many energy modelers who know how to model them well and accurately enough to make a business case for them. We've had several clients who are interested, and the stalling point always seems to be the energy modeling and the payback. And so if anyone knows someone who's great at that, please let me know, because we need help making that business case. The other thing is on the interior side, we're seeing less and less drop ceilings and partition walls, a lot more open office and so configuration. So there's less places to put the phase change materials so that they would be effective. And that's another challenge. So we've got to figure that out in addition to the modeling equation. And then the value of energy modeling on interior renovations, I think absolutely there is. It can be the daylighting and glare control. It can be the zoning, moving your occupied zones off the window wall and then having more flexibility of heat and cool range along that perimeter. It can, those are things, plug load controls, certainly. There are other factors. It depends on the scope of your renovation work, your interior renovation work. But there's plenty of value there for making decisions about layout, making decisions about lighting technology or controls, AV equipment, technology and controls. I think there's plenty of value there. So I hope that that very short answer addresses your concern. This is the NOAA Regional Center in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which is a beautiful location. And this was 2 World War II aircraft hangars that we were able to combine into one new facility. NOAA had their regional operations scattered in several buildings. I believe the Navy had these hangars and was not using them. And so, or it may have been another armed service. I think it was the Navy, if I'm not mistaken. And so essentially they weren't in use. They were dilapidated, and NOAA said, can we have them? Can we consolidate them, rehabilitate them and make them our new regional headquarters? And they do some submarine research and science there, tsunami and hurricane tracking, some public education component, a lot of office space, but a little bit of lab, public outreach, etc. And so in this case, this is a direct publicly funded project, fixed budget. And so anything we wanted to do that deviated from the norm had to fit within that fixed budget. And in this case, came in nearly 80% below the 2030 baseline several years ago. And this is one where the advanced modeling helped us really do something innovative with mechanical, stay under budget there, and have some budget left over for daylighting and optimization. And so this is the location. This is the condition of the facility when we got there. So we did have to keep the window to wall ratio the same because they were historic buildings, but we could do laminated glass for blast, as some of you may be familiar with. The program, as I mentioned, was primarily administrative office with some lab and support and public outreach space. And so what we essentially did, and I apologize, these are older animations because this project was in design over a decade ago. But what we did was basically create our own chiller plant with a deep sea well and pumping very cool water up to the surface. And then basically we're able to do a heat exchange as the trade winds pass over these buildings for latent cooling and dehumidify. And then as cool air wants to do, it drops. And we were able to distribute it through an underfloor air distribution system. And so that eliminated all the cooling towers, just about all the fans. Did add a pump for that deep sea well. So we were able to do that. And of course, as hot air rises, we were able to exhaust the building fairly passively as well. We had to do a lot of CFD analysis to make sure everyone would get adequate outside air and be thermally comfortable. But because we eliminated so much of the traditional equipment associated with a mechanical system of this type, it gave us some money back for daylight optimization. So we started looking at different scenarios. There were some existing skylights or things that had been in place before. We did look at those as a starting place and say, okay, we've got some clear stories, we've got some skylights, and the reality is just bringing daylight into a space doesn't always mean it's good daylight. You end up with insufficient light in some areas, and you end up with sometimes a high contrast between light and dark. And we call that glare. And so the human eye doesn't adjust very quickly. And so it makes the darker spaces seem even darker, and the light spaces seem brighter. And then the human eye just finds it visually unreadable and unusable light. So, you know, we were looking at different scenarios there and decided that we would like to try a lantern. And that's what we did. And we were able to do half-scale mock-ups and really study these to actually build some on-site trials. And we're able to both use simulation and those mock-ups to validate the design ideas to get good diffuse, even light distribution throughout the space without glare, and higher illumination levels, as you can see here, that really were sufficient daylight for the space and everyone within it. And so here is a rendering of what that looked like, and even better, photographs, and you can see the underfloor air diffusers, you can see those lanterns kind of hanging in the space. Also leveraged active design, the big open stair, things like that to get people moving. And in this case, just for the energy model itself, it was a 1 month payback, but when you looked at all the simulation, including daylighting and CFD, it was about 4 months, 4.5. So not bad at all. It did come in under budget, significant improvement in energy performance. And then, you know, I don't know exact annual energy performance numbers year over year, but we are told by our client that it performs consistent with expectations, and that's what we like to hear. So, and then the last long-ish case study is going to be the Oregon State Hospital. We had just finished one hospital for them that maybe blew the budget, I don't know, but they really ended up with very little for this next hospital, and or maybe budget was reallocated from the state budget elsewhere. I don't know, but this ended up with about $84 million for an inpatient mental health hospital, and we budget was tight enough that we were doing tilt wall construction, if that gives you a clue. But this is one where you know, we had modeled, and I'll go into some of the ECMs in a moment, but we predicted, you know, maybe a 70% improvement from 2030 baseline, and it actually performed even better than that. The modeled energy use intensity was, I think, around a 90. It's performing at half that, like 45 kV2 per square foot per year. We were able to do geothermal or ground source heat exchange, as well as solar PV and solar thermal hot water. And all of this for a very, very, very tight budget that was prefixed. And we were not able to ask for more money to make this higher performing. I'll get back to a couple of these questions I just saw pop up. This is the hospital here. Some of the ECMs, we asked for some code variances, 2 air changes in certain spaces where we, you know, this is not an acute care facility. We did not need to go up to, you know, a higher air change level, expanded temperature set point ranges with things like ceiling fans, select natural ventilation in certain spaces like the gymnasium. We did a nighttime flush pre-cooling of a lot of the facility. Of course, all the lighting was high efficiency. And then demand controlled ventilation lighting in the patient rooms, which is a really big deal. This is one of the major drivers for it for outperforming expectations. 100% outside air. We had enthalpy wheels, etc. Larger ducts, and then heat recovery chillers, or energy recovery chillers, chilled beams, and the ground source heat exchange. We also had a very limited window wall ratio, again, because of budget constraints, but we did a very tight envelope with a very high R value, leverage daylighting everywhere we could, high performance glazing, really focused on reduced infiltration. And then there's that geo exchange, which pretty much eliminated other types of equipment needs. So we added costs with the wells and the heat recovery chillers and the heat exchangers and the chilled beams. We reduced costs by getting rid of chillers and cooling towers and boilers and propane. And we were able to reduce the air handling unit sizes and weight. And then, sorry, I said bigger ductwork, smaller ductwork, and because of the chilled beams and reduced floor to floor height. So we were able to leverage all of those things to come in not just cost neutral, but cost neutral on a really tight budget. And the reason why it's performing better than expectations is because of that demand control ventilation lighting in the patient rooms. And they're actually using far less time in their rooms during the day than we had modeled for and anticipated. The patients are spending a lot more time out in the rest of the areas of the facility, common area rooms, recreational rooms, et cetera. And so that's as much as you can hope for, but it meant that the rooms turned down off hours, and the energy savings was able to be realized. And so we thought there would be a 5-month payback to that energy model based on cost and predicted savings. The actual performance lowered that down to 2.3 months. So a couple questions I want to revisit that popped up. What happens to the bodies on the top floor morgue if there's a multi-day power outage? Well, this is an N+1 facility, so there is 100% backup power. And then, as we've all seen during COVID, sometimes our morgue facilities are overstretched. This one has a very large capacity, but what you saw in COVID happening is that if they had to get refrigerated trucks, they could do that. We have not yet, I think, had that happen in DC, even during COVID, but as you've seen, many communities have, if they've had to exceed their more capacity, that's what they leverage. If for some reason the backup generator, which is again 100% building capacity, is covered, and we put the fuel supply right on the street, super easy to get to. We didn't make it difficult to continuously refuel that generator as needed. But if power is out of the building for more days, then the generator could handle, then you could store bodies elsewhere if you had to. So far, none of that has occurred. We haven't seen the power outage nor exceeding the existing storage in the facility. All right, and then wind energy model, I am going to get to that. So hold your seats. Constitution Square, this is a short one, but just for context, we're in the Northeast, just a little bit, above the Capitol. North Capitol Street runs down to the Capitol. There's 4 buildings, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We weren't very creative with the names. Constitution Square 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're all office buildings. The first 2 were spec and then ultimately leased by federal tenants. 1 short-term, 1 was long-term. 3 and 4 were build-to-suit, also leased long-term by federal tenants. The first 2 were started before DC had its Green Building Act passed, and so they weren't required to be green buildings. But while we were in CDs, our client literally said, and I apologize if anyone used the word literally, but they did say this, and I quote, "I don't want the last brown buildings on the block." If green buildings are going to be the new norm, even though it doesn't apply to our buildings, we want high performance buildings. 1 and 2 both sold very quickly after completion to a third party who was interested in the high performance buildings for long-term investor wealth building, if you will. And then 3 and 4, we had an investor who was interested even sooner while they were still in construction. So OB1, energy modeling payback, 2 months. And this one, even though it looks like a lot of glass, there's some, you're seeing one side of the building as you wrap around. There is reduced window to wall ratio, shadow boxing, spandrel glass, things like that help reduce that overall window wall ratio. high performance systems. And this one, I think the actual UI is a little lower now that we've entered this building performance standard era, and the new owners are working really hard on O&M. OB2 is performing a lot higher because the tenant that moved into it brought a data center with them, and that does happen sometimes. But I will point out that that UI is consistent, I think, with our current energy code without data. So, it was ahead of its time, certainly. And the payback is about 2 months. It was extended beyond what we expected because of that extra data load. OB3, energy model payback, a little under 2 months. And again, that one was secured a new owner while OB3 was finished, but we did the tenant fit out for 3 and 4 at the same time for the new owner. And then OB4 came around, and it's right here on this location. 500,000 square feet. And this one we completed in 2019, I think it's 2019, and certification beginning in 2020. So we knew we had an investor who's really interested in performance. While this was under construction, we were still in design though, we were in DD when our mechanical package was over budget. And so it's like, what are we gonna do? We have an interested investor who will sign the papers in CA essentially if this project can come in on budget and with maintaining a good performance. And so super interested in that. And our engineering consultant said, hear me out. What if we went with slightly more expensive glass, but a little less of it? I think we're just on the edge of our peak cooling loads that we can reduce the peak cooling load enough to get rid of a chiller. And our client said, walk out the door and do it right now. And so we did. We upgraded the glass and we reduced the window to wall ratio from 56 to 51%. That's the finished building. It doesn't really look dramatically different. It's not a huge change. And the net savings after those changes was $500,000. And the predicted energy use intensity went from 32 to 28 kBTU. For those of you at home, lower EUI is good. It's a better performing outcome. And so our third-party investor, new owner, was super excited about that. Better building, better performance. How often does value engineering result in actually improving the performance of the asset? But in this case, it did. And so this just, I think, really underscores the importance of finding first cost neutral solutions. There was 0 time for payback in operational savings. This client sold the building while it was under construction. They did not care if it was a 6-month payback or a 1-year payback or a 5-year payback. They would not see any of those savings. So anything that added cost, regardless of how great the performance was probably not going to fly. So we had to find a solution that would manage performance outcomes while also keeping us under budget. And I was so worried we were going to lose the efficiency of the HVAC system, and so grateful that we were able to adjust the architectural design, the glazing selection, and the mechanical design to get all of the things we wanted and improve the performance and stay under budget. So to the question from one of our attendees who said, when to energy model? I'm glad you asked. There is a standard for energy modeling that we think is very helpful. It was compiled by both architects and engineers. So this isn't just an engineering standard. It was really put together by an integrated team, if you will. It is the ASHRAE 209 standard, Energy Simulation Aided Design for Buildings Except for Low-Rise Residential. So this is the timeline of design and construction, maybe simplified, but here we are. Planning and programming, concept, SD, DD, CD, CA, closeout, and CFO, and occupancy. Now we have our 6 steps to integrated design, discovery and definition, like set your targets, climate in place. Okay, we did my climate analysis. This is where I start to alter the building design based on climate orientation. Is this a cooling dominated or heat dominated climate? All that kind of stuff. And then load reduction. Am I going to change my orientation and massing? Am I going to alter the window to wall ratio? Am I going to add solar shades? What am I going to do? Integrated solutions. Now that I've reduced my loads, let me plug in some efficient mechanical systems and lighting systems to address those loads as efficiently as possible. And then once I've done all those things, now I can look at renewable energy solutions. I don't want to start generating energy until after I've reduced my demand as much as possible. And then ultimately, occupancy is really important as buildings get more efficient. occupants, their behavior and plug loads become an increasingly large portion of building energy demand. In new office buildings, it could be 30% of building energy demand or more. And so we really, really have to focus on that. And it's not just occupant behavior and plug loads, but it's also how people reconfigure buildings to use them differently than they told you they would when you were designing them, which 100% of the time, by the time people move into the buildings we've designed, I feel like they're using it differently than they said they would when we were designing them. So, so that occupancy phase is really important, because it's how do we update our design and the configuration of it and our anticipated outcomes and management plans, so that that building continues to perform well over time. So our minimum, regardless of scope, even small, fast projects, even interior projects, all of them must use, we have some internal tools and external tools, must use these tools to do target setting and climate analysis and do some basic passive design strategies, period. All projects have a minimum of 40 hours that they have to set aside for that type of work in our firm, unless it's a very small project, like you're only doing test fits. And it's not relevant yet, that kind of thing. But if you're starting to design space, interior or big buildings, whatever it is, you've got to work on that. And then setting your 2030 targets. Every project has to have a target. Is it a lighting power density target? Is it an energy use intensity target for the whole building? What is it? And for interiors, we use lighting power density as a proxy for energy because plug loads are unregulated in our building energy code. Not that you shouldn't manage those and model for those, but they are not something that we can necessarily set a target for early on, but you should be having the conversation with your client about plug load management and plug load expectations. And then doing that architectural load reduction model, the whole building design energy model, and then again, that final compliance model. So ASHRAE 209 has 11 cycles of modeling. Do you have to do all of them? No, you do not. At a minimum, they want you to do load reduction modeling, just to even say you're using the standard, because that's probably one of the most critical steps. I'm going to walk you through each of these, so don't feel like you have to write all that down really fast. This is a rough layout of timeline. It doesn't mean you can't shift some of these steps forward if you're working on a particularly energy intensive or complex project. If I'm working on a lab, I might move everything forward a phase. I might be doing simple box modeling and concept design modeling in programming and planning, for example. I might be doing load reduction modeling in concept. So this is not a hard and fast rule. I just wanted to sort of lay it out as an approximation of when you might do this. I also think this standard is incredibly helpful for communicating, sorry, I have a cat, communicating with your clients about what kind of modeling we're talking about, when we're talking about doing it, and what are the outcomes that we expect from our modeling. Just to say energy modeling is included in the scope is not sufficient, because it doesn't say when we're doing it, how often we're doing it, and what kind of information we're trying to get from that modeling process. Using the standard and saying, here's all of the cycles, we are including cycle, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 6 in our baseline fee. The rest are ad services, could be really helpful. So the client's expectations are managed. And if they come back and say, I'm going to make a bunch of changes for value engineering or change orders during construction, you can say, remember, we left those cycles out. Those are ad services. And now we have a basis for going back and asking for the additional fee needed to update the model, should that occur. So it's really helpful to have this really clearly spelled out and defined so we can all reference common language and expectations as to what we're talking about when we're talking about doing it. Just because it's 11 cycles doesn't mean it's 11 models. A lot of it is just updating the model with new information over time. So it doesn't mean 11 different models. Now, simple box modeling is often called shoebox modeling, but it is kind of what it sounds like. This is understanding your basic site and program impacts on performance. It's design neutral, orientation neutral often, and this is really sort of vetting sometimes very early ideas, like should we be thinking geothermal, should we be thinking radiant systems, I don't know. But it is, before there's really a gelled design, let's get some early information about what we need to consider in the design process. And then when you get to concept design modeling, that's when we start to apply this information to a design that we're starting to develop. So maybe I'm changing my orientation a little bit. Maybe I'm starting to refine the massing. Is it a courtyard building? Is it a bar? Is it, you know, a tower? But this is where we start taking that concept, that very early design concept, and we start applying simulation to it to see how it would perform with those changes. Load reduction modeling is really understanding the impacts of things like window to wall ratio, solar shading, maybe it's floor to floor height and duct sizing on a high air change rate building, but understanding peak loads. And because those affect your system sizing, how many chillers or what size chillers do I need? How many boilers do I need? The HVAC capacity is going to be based on your peak loads, not your annual energy use. And yet we do all of our modeling based on annual energy use or annual energy cost. But you want to know what the peak is, and can I reduce the peak? Because that's where we get those construction cost savings. So first, look at peak load reduction. Maybe it's reducing window to wall ratio. Maybe it's reducing it on your south or west facing windows so that you don't get all that heat gain. I don't know, it depends on where you are. Maybe you want the heat gain. Then we go into HVAC system selection modeling. Okay, now I have a basic idea of the loads I've created with my architecture. Is, you know, a VAV system the right system? Is a radiant system the right system? You know, what am I looking at? And so this is where we start to identify different potential systems, and you know, sometimes the delta between them isn't significant. Sometimes it is. There's also operational considerations to discuss with your client. And then design refinement modeling. Okay, this is a project. On the top, you know, or the left, you see concepts. On the right, you see how the model changed as we continue to refine the design. We had a lot of red space on those windows, so it's like, okay, let's extend those overhangs, those shades, so that we get more green. Green is good on those facades. We're reducing the solar radiation, which means glare and solar heat gain and increased cooling loads. Let's optimize that as much as possible. So more green is better. And then that design integration and optimization modeling. Okay, I've optimized my architecture. How do I continue to optimize the HVAC and architecture together? And maybe that's we're playing with floor to floor heights, we're playing with different systems. Maybe we've eliminated the perimeter heat system as we did in St. Louis, but we're looking at trade-offs, we're fine tuning the design, the delivery. Maybe that's where I'm taking into consideration the perimeter heat zone, and I don't need, you know, such narrow set points because my layout allows me to have that buffer zone on the perimeter, whatever, however design proceeds. And then of course, the refinement of the design itself, all of the different components and programming and controls and everything that go with the selected system. Then we get into energy simulation aided value engineering, and that's what you saw on our Constitution Square 4 project. That is where we are in a value engineering process, but we were using energy simulation and energy modeling, load calculations, et cetera, to validate our decisions, or at least inform them. And in some cases, we're able to improve performance. We're not always able to, but at a minimum, we should know what we're doing. If we're making a certain decision, what is the anticipated outcome of that decision? And is everyone okay with that? Are we still going to meet code? Are we still going to meet the stretch goals the client has? Are there incentives? Are we putting those incentives in danger? Is there a long-term transparency or building performance standard issue that we should be concerned with? And are we going to impact how this building performs under those types of policies? Are we increasing our risk as architects? I think that's a really important thing to understand. And if there's any engineers on the call, it's shared risk, right? We all need to understand, and we can point to this, and we can have a very clear paper trail of the meetings and discussions where we set a target at the beginning of the project. We communicated that if we made these changes to the design, what we thought the outcome would be, or if the client waives the necessity of updating the model, meeting minutes say client, chose to waive an updated energy model and, any kind of understanding of the impacts of this decision. Circulate those meeting minutes. There's a clear paper trail that we had that conversation. We advised there could be energy impacts. We advised the client to update that model. If they choose not to, can't force their hand, but we've now documented that the conversation was had. This is key to risk management. And I hate to say that, we have to do it, but we live in a litigious society, and we all know whether you're right or wrong, you might have met the code, you might not have done anything wrong, but we all know that legal action can be costly and time consuming to defend. Even if you win your case down the road, we'd like to avoid it if we can. So best to just have these conversations early and continue to have them often about anticipated performance outcomes. It's also part of the AIA Code of Ethics that we will talk to our clients about the impact of our buildings on climate change and associated risks. So let's do that. As designed performance model, that's the permit model. Notice this is like 8 cycles in. This is finally the model that you submit for your permit or for your lead documentation. There's a lot of modeling that came before that, potentially, depending on the scope of work you have. And then the change order model. I am in construction. Now I do a lot of lab buildings. Sometimes there's shelf space when we go for permit because we don't know yet how that space will be built out. But as we make changes to the design, now we've got maybe a new PI at the school who's going to lead certain types of research, and we know how to fit out this lab. Or we've got a funder who's made some money available to fit out one of the floors. Okay, so we have change orders. We've changed the design. Maybe there were other change orders related to cost overruns. Regardless, the building has changed in the construction process, and we know that happens a lot. So change order models update our anticipated performance outcomes. So we all understand what happens when we make those changes. So when someone says, why doesn't the building performance match the design model that you did at the end of your design phase, we can say, because we made all these changes in construction, and here's the updated model based on those changes. If they waive their right to have that model update, at least we can say, we advised you of that. There's a reason why there's a discrepancy in performance outcome. It's because we made changes in design during the construction process. Anytime you want to update that model, however, it's a great idea to do it. As-built energy performance. This is a model that you update at the end of construction, like it says, as-built, and maybe you hand it over to the client so that they can use it for management of building performance. Maybe not. Maybe it's something you just hold on to for your own records. But often we have clients who are interested in either it's monitoring-based commissioning for the lead credit, which used to be M&V, or other post-occupancy performance analysis. And if it's a long-term owner-occupier, they may want this. It may be very helpful to them. And then there's that post-occupancy performance comparison. Okay, I have the as-built. It's as accurate as it can be based on the way we delivered the building. How is it doing and why? And so in the case of the Oregon State Hospital, it was performing better than modeled, and we dug in to see which parts of the building were using less energy and why, and we found out it was because patients were not spending as much time in their rooms. And so that demand controlled ventilation and demand controlled lighting, those issues in the patient rooms was really critical to its success. And it's something we would advocate for again on a similar project. And if we had to get a variance with a local jurisdiction, we would use that as evidence of why that was really important and how effective it was. So different tools, and this is not a comprehensive list of tools. These are tools that we commonly work with. There are other tools out there that are also good tools. I just don't want to describe tools that we're not using to you because I don't think I do it as well as I could. But early design, we're using things like Ladybug tools, which are free. Those work on Rhino. We use Climate Studio, which is not, but is a very good set of tools, also working on Rhino. Autodesk Insight or Insight 360. This works in Revit. Some of our projects go straight into Revit. And this allows you to benchmark your EUI target, to model the idea of certain mechanical systems, even if you're not modeling the designed system. And so we can benchmark against our 2030 goals, for example, very early on. And if we're already in Revit, then we have a tool that allows us to do all of the things these Rhino-based tools allow us to do very early, but in Revit. IES is it's my favorite whole building energy modeling software. It is a licensed software, so not all engineers will work with it, but it takes your design straight from Revit into the energy modeling software, so it's not a manual input, and I think that's really critical. And when I showed you this building right here, our client had not signed off on these overhangs, and there was a lot of back and forth, and what if it obstructs my view? And we had like all kinds of 3D simulation they could walk through, and virtual reality. And finally, using IES, we were able to model it very quickly, importing it straight into Revit, even with the complex geometry. And we said, if you get rid of those overhangs, you either have to go to that 50% window to wall ratio, or you're going to have to increase your chiller plant size by 13%. And here's what that looks like. And they said, we're keeping the overhangs, facade design approved, let's move on. So really helpful to have the ability to do that quickly, and with the complex geometry, a manual entry software. All I can say is our consultant was struggling with it till we moved into IES, and then that made it a lot easier. There's 2 free tools, Energy Plus and eQuest, that are built on the DO2 backbone, funded by the Department of Energy. Those are also really, really good. They just are manual entry. There are other whole building software, some of which were created by companies that manufacture air conditioning equipment. I would say that those are not as helpful, in part because they are trying to sell you air conditioning equipment, not reduce your loads and sell you less air conditioning equipment. So keep that in mind. Who is the source, and are they building software that is a design tool or an air conditioning equipment sales tool? And then finally, there's lots of asset management tools out there. I don't have as much personal experience with them, so I did not include some of the ones that are better, but I will say Energy Star Portfolio Manager is a really great free place to start for anyone who's got an existing building, wants to plug in data about how it's performing and compare it back to their design case. And in design, you can use Energy Star Target Finder to predict an Energy Star score, and then on the back end, you can get an actual Energy Star score and compare. A lot of jurisdictions will require a Target Finder score as part of their permit process. So those are just a handful of the tools we use regularly. There are, as I said, many more out there. But you know, there are, and they're great tools. They're just tools we don't happen to use as regularly. That being said, I am open for additional questions, and I'm going to kind of go through and see which ones I did not hit in the Q&A. And if you have other questions, now is a great time to go ahead and plug those into the Q&A bar. I have a question that says, is it important to model the envelope separately from lighting and HVAC? Based on time, since they're good for 30, 50, and 100 years, and lights and HVAC get replaced less often. I'd say there's an interrelationship in terms of energy performance. So you do want to understand how the enclosure helps with load adjustment for the sizing of your HVAC system, as well as daylighting. So it's good to evaluate those in concert with one another. But if you're doing a life cycle cost analysis, or LCCA, or life cycle cost assessment, LCCA, then the payback timeframes and the lifespan of those systems does play a role. So just looking at energy performance, look at them together. But when you're looking at a life cycle cost assessment, then consider how long each of them last. I did address the phase change materials question, I believe, but if you've got any additional questions about that, please do plug them into the Q&A. Can you speak to the value of energy modeling on interiors? I believe I spoke to that. But if you have any other questions on that, please ask. Someone asked about Cove Tool. We have used it on a project in concert with a consultant of ours who used it regularly at Emory. It's a health science research building. It was a part of the evaluation and decision-making process. At the time, I think it was less suited for lab buildings, and I do believe, I understand that they have made updates to the software to make it better for lab buildings in addition to other building types. So I think our clients certainly felt like it was a really great tool for selecting optimized bundles of design options, if that makes sense. They were looking at a whole range of things and really wanted to hone in on like what combination of decisions got them to the best performance the most cost effectively, literally looking at cost per kBTU per square foot per year. Like this bundle is $60,000 per kBTU, this one is $90,000 per kBTU saved. And so that really helped them quite a bit. We presented at Greenville a couple of years on that. So I think it can be very valuable. We don't use it as regularly, but again, we have another project where we've partnered with a consultant who uses Cove Tool for Morgan State University in Baltimore, and I believe it's been really helpful there too. Standards for measuring glare. Yes, I would say though, most importantly, like we know what the right lighting levels are and we know what overlit levels are, and doing a simulation, like how much light is in the space. is important, and understanding how the space is used. So that complex geometry building I showed you, it was in Florida, and we were looking at where we needed custom shades at the perimeter because of the complex geometry. And so we did a combination of like program layout and where people sitting close enough to the window, and where were there spaces where certain times of the year the sun angle is just low enough that even those overhangs couldn't be extended enough to block all of that daylight. And so you're looking at sun angle, you're looking at overlit conditions, any of those things. And so we found there are certain spaces where nobody was working regularly in those spaces, close enough to the window wall. Maybe it was circulation space or storage space, but it was fine. We didn't need the custom shades. And then we found other spaces where people were close enough that at certain times of the year, you could see the sun come in, and it created too much light in those spaces for certain times of the year, which would make it difficult to see your computer screen. And so it depends on what you're designing and where it is and your program layout and everything. But yes, there are lots of ways to take a look at that. Do we submeter, including performance sensors to monitor building over time? Most of our clients do go with submetering. It's a wide range of submetering, how much information they want or can use. And where possible, we love to get post-occupancy information. The transparency standards that are out there that disclose building performance issues over time are really helpful, because I can go look up our buildings and see how they're doing, at least on the whole. And then I can reach out to our clients and say, what's going on over there? The challenge is so many of our buildings change hands, like they resell to an investor, or the same institution owns them, but different people are in place, and you don't always have the right contacts to say what's going on over there. When possible, we love to get nuanced information about performance. How is it performing granularly? Break it down for me, and let's understand why some things are doing better and some things are doing worse than we expect. We don't always have the relationships in place over time to get that information, but we sure do try. The transparency policies are really helpful, because I can find out how the building's doing, whether I know who the owner is anymore or not, at least at the aggregate level. What systems do we use for LCCA? I believe that's like what analysis systems do we use, tools. There are free tools out there. I know FEMP, the Federal Energy Management Program, has a free tool you can get to. There's a lot of things on the whole building design guide. I think there's other tools. A lot of our clients kind of start to create their own based on the systems they want to investigate. Some people are doing water reclamation and they want to include that in the LCCA. Some are looking just at mechanical. Some want to include the enclosure system, including the roof. And so the tools that are able to do that can vary. You might have a consultant who can help if you have a client that builds a lot, because it's the cost of acquisition, the cost of development, construction, and the cost of ownership. And so you're going to need all that information to plug in, unless you want to just use industry sort of defaults, but they vary so much from one place to the next that I think it's really important to get, particularly for a sophisticated organization that might have different building types in their portfolio. You want to get good information from your client, not just use defaults. And so for that, I don't know that you can work entirely in a pre-populated tool, but you might be able to customize a pre-populated tool or build one in concert with like a cost estimator that you work with regularly. So I don't know if that helps. Are there additional resources for a smaller firm to go to about designing their own in-house sustainability evaluation tool that would be better suited for their specific project types locations? I mean, Rhino, the Ladybug tools are free. So regardless of firm size, if you are working in Rhino, use Ladybug tools. It's super helpful. And if you're in Revit, then the Insight 360 is very helpful. They're both going to give you feedback based on location and project type. The only thing I would say, if you're an architect, is be leery of using either to model things like hospitals or labs, because those are so driven by plug lids and ventilation and less by architectural decisions. We can certainly influence energy demand by taller floor to floor heights and bigger ducts, or thermal programming, like, oh, I get free passive solar reheat if I put my labs on the southwest. And we want a good consultant who can help us understand that while we're in those phases of design. But I don't know that any of those tools like Insight 360 or Ladybug Tools or Climate Studio are going to do all that for you. There's still no substitute for good intelligence and experience. And so both on the architecture side and the engineering side, having good partners on those really complex buildings, I think is key. But outside of that, for academic buildings, office buildings, other buildings that are more external load driven, those are all great tools. And there's plenty of free ones. You don't have to buy the licensed versions. And you can customize Ladybug Tools internally if you've got anyone who knows how to do that. I know we have folks who write scripts all the time for those Rhino-based tools, so that we have some quick, and those are designers. It's not like a whole specialty staff necessarily, but designers are like, oh, I wrote a script for a project, and other people can use it. Just save it in a shared location so that your colleagues can get to it. So I think
Okay, and I think that's
good time. Sorry.
That's now, if you've made it this far, you can see why we asked Anna to come and speak. To let you also know, she'll be back sometime in the near future here to do another one. She's consented to do another program with us. And Anna, thank you for an outstanding presentation.
Thank you so much.
And if for those of you who made it this far, the staff will submit your number to AIA California. We'll turn it into national, so you don't have to worry about turning it in. If you want a certificate, contact Hillary Keck at AIA California, and she'll tell you how to handle that. And stay tuned, practice modeling, and come on back. And thank you again, and see you all soon. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.